we look at the configuration drift that you mentioned, that also goes unnoticed until it causes problems, right? Can you give an example of the risks this creates?
So when a cyber criminal does this, there I like to split it between loud and quiet changes. A loud change is going to be obvious. There are also quiet changes. These are the things that I will change that unless you go into the menu, you're not going to notice.
Overprivileged account super users remain a persistent challenge. How can security leaders reduce standing privilege without creating friction for administrators and the end user?
It's not how do we manage privileges, it's how do we reduce the standing privileges, because that's the key to preventing the impact of an attack when it happens.
Hello and welcome to the Security Strategist podcast, where we discuss real world cybersecurity challenges and solutions. I'm Trisha Pillay, editor here at EM360 Tech, and your host for this episode. Now, what we're going to be tackling is a topic at the heart of modern enterprise risk, and that's cyber resilience in Microsoft 365 environments and what tenant hardening really means in practice. Most organizations assume that because they're operating in a cloud first ecosystem like Microsoft 365, a large portion of their security posture is inherently handled. But as many security leaders are discovering, that assumption leaves critical gaps. I am joined by Rob Edmondson, Senior Director, Product Marketing at Coreview. Rob, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Trisha. Good to be here.
So, before we get into it, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your role at Coreview?
For sure. Yeah, I've been in the world of technology now for about a decade, focused on various different SaaS companies, all of which have been involved in cybersecurity in a lot of different areas. And right now, working for Coreview, I'm pretty much exclusively, we as an organization are exclusively focused on Microsoft 365. So my day to day is, really learning about how organizations use that technology and what it means to build cyber resilience there. My role specifically, I work in the product team and function here at Coreview. So that's where I sit, get exposed a lot to what people are asking us for, and always excited about what we're going to build next.
Sounds interesting. So I want to get into the conversation, but I want to start more broadly, right? As we mentioned, many organizations believe that Microsoft 365, the environment is secure by default. From your experience, where does that confidence come from and where does it actually fall short?
It's a really good question. I think that one of the big challenges that we have is how Microsoft 365 has changed very slowly. So if you go back to 2011, when Office 365 was announced, it was a really small thing. It was Word, Excel, PowerPoint in the cloud with email. And so for most people's perspective is if I deal with the email bit, which became an issue back then, I've basically done most of what I need to do in terms of security and resilience. That email plus data backup, I'm done. And that was definitely true in 2011. We now are 15 years out from there. And it's no longer Office 365, it's Microsoft 365. And that change is significant because it's the Office is no longer the core thing. There is a huge number of apps and services. In fact, the last time we counted, there were 60 now, which is crazy. I mean, it's gone up from 40 just a few years ago to 60. And some of those are absolutely mission critical. So you've got Entra, the foundation of your entire identity security is in your Microsoft tenant. SharePoint defines files, data sharing. Exchange is the email bit we talked about. You've got Intune, which has huge power over your devices. You've got Defender, which is composed of 7 different identity platforms, all kind of stitched together in a funny way. Purview, Teams, you could go on and on. These services, if you lose them, if they're misconfigured, if something goes wrong there, it is game over. And that's such a huge change from where we were in 2011, where, if your PowerPoint or Word doesn't work today, it's frustrating, but your organization isn't going to get compromised. It's just your next sales meeting might be a bit frustrating. So that the change there has been enormous. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people still carry assumptions from a few years ago, quite rightly, because Microsoft never put their hand up and said, hey, by the way, this thing has changed dramatically. You need to change your security strategy. That's the conversation that we've got to have today.
That's a very interesting point because I didn't know they had from 40 to 60. So a lot of people would learn a lot from this, that Microsoft 365 is actually way more services involved, right? But when you look at that, even in organizations with strong governance and dedicated cybersecurity teams, some Microsoft 365 security weaknesses often go unnoticed until they actually cause problems, right? Like you mentioned, there's so many that you have to monitor. Why do these gaps persist in such well established organizations?
The answer is so boring, but you have to start with visibility. So, one of the main reasons all of us are probably more exposed than we realize is because we don't have the visibility to realize. Visibility is always catching up with threats because cyber criminals thrive in the shadows. It's the same with your Microsoft environment. So there are many things that organizations do today to build security. Cyber criminals gravitate towards the areas that you haven't dealt with yet. And a really good example with this with Microsoft tenants is Microsoft doesn't have an out of the box capability that they give you that will alert you whenever your configurations change, which is it's kind of unbelievable given how sensitive configurations are in your Microsoft tenant. If I can go in and change your Entra configurations, change your Intune configurations, I change your security posture for your entire business, not just for your Microsoft tenant. I can change it. You won't get alerted to that. So if I'm a cyber criminal and I get into your tenant, I know the odds are you're going to kick me out before I can achieve my goals. Hopefully, maybe not, but hopefully you'll kick me out. So I'm going to do things right now whilst I'm in the tenant to give myself a foot in next time I need to get back in. So these configurations will be changed by attackers. So one of the reasons why organizations who have mature practices, who do their best, one of the reasons why they might still be exposed is just no one's giving you visibility of that. And as a consequence, it's pretty hard for you to measure what is your configuration state. Just as one example.
So, when you're talking about these infrastructures, we look at architecture, the legacy architecture, right? How hard is it to actually, you did touch on it briefly, but I want to get more into it. How hard is it for entrepreneurs or maybe bigger organizations rather to shift into this to actually be have more visibility? We know that we always talk about unstructured data, we talk about, now you say, configuration, but what is the gap that needs to be bridged in order for them to be more, you mentioned visibility, but how do they do that? It's easy to say, but what steps do they need to take?
Well, let me just preface this by saying there is an approach you can take to that, and I'll explain it. But really, this is one of these unique situations where there are other applications and services out there where you just wouldn't need to do this. So Microsoft is so big, it's so critical that it deserves this sort of unique approach. But let's just imagine Monday.com. You wouldn't be going in there thinking, well, how do I improve my visibility of my configurations? Someone can go and change the configurations in Monday. They could cause problems there, but it's not going to be an issue because Microsoft's so big and so critical. It deserves this sort of approach. Now, what is that? What we see when we work with organizations who are concerned about this is they might come to us and they already actually have visibility. The challenge for them is the visibility process is taking so long because what they're doing is they're using an Excel sheet and they're going through their entire tenant and they're figuring out one tenant, maybe multiple tenants, and they're going through and they're keeping track of what their configuration should be across all the different services. Now, bear in mind, a Microsoft tenant has about 10,000 different configuration details that you can tweak. You've got configurations, and then inside a configuration, you've got policy details. So, for example, you might have a whole bunch of conditional access policies that, in one sense, that's one configuration, which might have 10, 15 details inside of it. And you might have dozens or hundreds of different conditional access policies. So, those are variations of just one type of thing. Organizations we work with sometimes have hundreds of thousands. One organization we worked with had over 1 million unique configurations. So if you want to create a spreadsheet, get ready to be doing some serious detail. Smaller, medium to enterprise size organizations, maybe up to about 10,000 users. We speak with them, they try and do this. It's very time consuming. Larger than that, I think it becomes maybe needing to build a custom tool. And what they're doing is they're keeping track of them. They're also sometimes taking screenshots as well. As analog as that approach is, as slow as it is, as many gaps as it has, at least you have a document. And if you're a really large organization, you're thinking, well, there's no way we can do this. At the very least, document what you want your configurations to be for your most critical ones. Because if somehow you lose your tenant, which happens more than I ever realized it would. I'd heard stories when I first came to Coreview, and now having been exposed to a number of breaches, it happens a lot. If someone takes control of your tenant and you need to reconfigure, it's really critical that just your basic configurations, you know what they should be. Even if you can't document them all, at least the basics, you've got some idea. It is going to speed up the process of getting rebuilt, which is already going to be a painfully long process that you'll be without your Microsoft environment. So um, Excel sheets, screenshots, and if that's still overwhelming, start with the priority configurations.
That sounds like a very tedious process, but I guess it has to be done.
Yeah, I mean that's what you've got to do if you're just relying on out of the box capabilities. Yeah.
We look at the configuration drift that you mentioned that also goes unnoticed until it causes problems, right? Can you give an example of the risks this creates?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's break down configuration drift and configuration tampering as well, and kind of build a story here, 'cause it's actually really interesting. The changes that happen in your tenant can happen because of a number of reasons. Number one, cyber criminals, like I mentioned, they know nearly every organization out there has no alerting. So for them, it's an obvious technique. If I have access, I'm going to tweak things. So for example, I may establish a trusted connection with another tenant that I actually control, so that if I get kicked out, I've got this kind of passageway back in. I may set up mail forwarding on a bunch of users so that when I get kicked out, I'm receiving sensitive communications, which makes it far easier for me to phish the organization the next time. There's a whole host of toys to play with as a cyber criminal. I could create an Entra application that allows me to get back into the tenant with privileges, even though you've kicked me out, all these things. So when a cyber criminal does this, I like to split it between loud and quiet changes. A loud change is going to be obvious. You might notice a huge influx of attacks, and it's obviously something's happened. Or they might change your conditional access policies and kick everyone out of the tenant. These are loud changes. Like you know something's happened. There are also quiet changes. These are the things that I will change that unless you go into the menu, you're not going to notice, but it's going to benefit me as an attacker because I know the change I've made and I can exploit it. But it's not just attackers. You've also got examples of internal staff accidentally causing mayhem. We had one instance where a newly onboarded customer called us at 3 a.m, panicked because they'd accidentally deleted their distribution groups. For this organization, this is a large healthcare organization. Their distribution groups were set up to enable daily communications throughout multiple critical healthcare organizations. So in the morning, the emails would flow through these groups in the right way. Communications came out. They'd accidentally deleted them. And the crazy thing is, and I asked one of our technical team, I was like, how easy is it just to delete this? And he said, it's just 2 clicks. I'm not day to day like a Microsoft administrator, but I think sometimes we forget that in our organizations, if someone has privileges, 2 clicks to delete thousands of distribution groups that were set up in a very particular way. So they're thinking, number one, I don't know how to reset these. Number two, even if I do, how long is it going to take? Luckily, they were onboarded into Coreview. It was just a process of rewinding, because with Coreview, you can rewind your configuration state back to where it was, and everything was fine. But it's just a great example that administrators make mistakes. We all do, all the time. The other day, I was on a call with 2 Microsoft MVPs, and they were sharing with me, anonymously, just similar stories of like chaos that happens because admins make mistakes. So changes happen there. And the other thing is, Microsoft themselves. Microsoft roll out updates, and one of the things our customers complain to us about Microsoft is they say, we were on premise before. Microsoft forced us to move to the cloud, which they're doing, with all their customers. On premise, when Microsoft released an update, you had the ability to test it in a limited capacity before you rolled it out into your organization. That meant that if something about the update caused you a problem, you didn't have to roll it out. With Microsoft 365, they're in control of the updates. So they roll these out. And last year, there was this story that came out that in a Microsoft update, they had accidentally deleted customized device compliance profiles. So these are the device compliance profiles are the way that you kind of build your endpoint security in Intune. And there is this customization layer where people have been, adding all their own details for their organizations, fine tuning based on their needs. This update just wiped all of that out. The crazy thing is, Microsoft didn't even know. It was only when these organizations, someone either was compromised or had gone in and discovered it, and the reports came back, and then Microsoft realized. So it's another example. Like, you've got attackers, you've got internal staff, you've even got Microsoft. Sometimes you're going to know about the change, sometimes you're not going to know about the change. And all of this highlights just, again, that need for visibility. So those are some examples of the sorts of things that can happen in an organization in terms of configuration changes, and why it's so critical to be on top of it.
It's actually quite scary, just 2 clicks, eh? But when we look at data, data is one of the big things that many organizations either put a lot of attention to or not. So when we look at data backup in Microsoft 365, it gets a lot of attention, but configuration backup gets less, right? Why is it just critical for cyber resilience? And what happens when an organization can't restore a known good state?
Yeah, this is such an important point. And right now at Coreview, we're on a mission to explain this to people because, um, you know, everybody, when we think about backup, we think about data. And if the definition of good backup is to have your data backed up, as an industry, we're doing really well. The last survey we ran of 500 IT leaders, 96% of people had their data backed up. So, this is pretty good. Um, Configuration backup is a new thing. And again, it comes back to the unique beast that Microsoft 365 is. To use the example of Monday again, I am not going to bother backing up my Monday configurations. If someone deletes them, I'm going to be annoyed, but it's just not that important. Because we're now with Microsoft 365, we've gone from Office, it's become this huge beast, this critical foundation for the entire organization with so many configurations. The fact that it's so critical and so big, now it needs its own configuration backup. To give you some examples of how that's going to help you, we can go back to the examples I just shared of someone deleting configurations and then just needing to restore them. That's one example. Or a cyber criminal going in and changing a whole bunch of stuff. You get visibility of what's changed, but also you can just rewind after the incident to get you back to your rigorous kind of secure configuration. The really alarming thing that we see is what we call total tenant takeover. This is where an attacker gets into the environment, they get enough privilege that they can start to elevate, and then they finally get access to the crown jewels, one of these super powerful privileged accounts. They kick everybody out of the tenants, and then they hold you to ransom. Now, just to be clear, we're not talking here about ransomware. We're talking about an attacker getting complete control of your environment, kicking you out and saying, if you want the environment back, you need to pay a certain amount of money, whatever that is. First time I heard this, I was like, wow, that's a really crazy story, that poor organization. 2-3 years into being here at Coreview, it happens so much, it's terrifying. The thing is, organizations won't tell you about it because it's embarrassing and it's not good for the brand. So in this situation, what happens? I'll give you an example of, again, like an anonymous government agency, very large, and if you knew who they were, it would be pretty shocking. They had this happen. They were kicked out. Cyber criminals basically say, pay this money. They say, no, we've got our business continuity plan. We've got our data backed up. So they spin up a new tenant and they realize, well, wait a second, we can't put the data into this environment because it's not secured yet. We need to configure it. What were our configurations? So, this is where the Excel sheet would have been handy. They didn't know the configurations. They started to figure it out. They start thinking, well, this configuration process is going to take so long. And they start the reconfiguration process. We're talking weeks here. One of the crazy things was not just the time in which the organization was unable to function, but also the fact that their data backup wasn't working inside of the tenants. So this organization had invested millions into the best of breed data backup vendors, and they were trying to redeploy the data backup into the tenant, but it wasn't working. Why? It turns out once the configurations were back to where they were supposed to be, the data was able to go into the tenant. But what we've discovered through experiences like this is your data in the Microsoft tenant references configurations. It's related to the configuration state. I'm a user. I've got an identity. That's a configuration. So my identity is connected to a bunch of files and all sorts of stuff. Unless those two things kind of can connect, the data backup may not necessarily work. So there's a few things to say here. Firstly, if you're a large enough organization, you need to have a way to restore your configurations in a scenario like this. How do I get my environment back? Think about the analogy of a glass of water. Most organizations back up the water in the glass. Okay, so if I throw the water on the ground, you can say, well, I've got my Veeam or my Rubrik or whatever your data backup vendor is, I can pour it back in. Everything's fine. Cyber criminals sometimes take the glass away. Sometimes they smash entire chunks of the glass. If you try and pour the water back in, it's going to spill everywhere. You've got to back up the water, but also the glass. And the Microsoft 365 tenant is like, it's the big glass that your entire organization is living inside of. So configuration backup for this environment is critical. Like I said, there are some parts of your environment where it's just not that important, but this is, especially given these kinds of attacks that we're seeing.
So that's very interesting. Actually, it's stuff that you actually see in the movies that it's actually happening in real life, right? Especially what you said now. But you've touched on this, but I want to go a little bit deeper on it. Overprivileged account super users remain a persistent challenge, like you said. How can security leaders reduce standing privilege without creating friction for administrators and the end user?
I like the way you phrase the question. It's a really good way to phrase the question because as an industry, and I worked in identity security during the big boom that industry had. And back then the question was, how do we manage privileges, right? But actually, the real question we should be asking is, how do we reduce them significantly? Um, when it comes to Microsoft 365, what most organizations have done over the last decade is they take the privileged accounts and they put them inside of a PAM vault, right? You put them in a box and you say you need to authenticate to get access to them. It's a great start. Here's the challenge. I'm going to get access to that as an administrator. And when I do, that privileged account has way, way, way too much privilege. It's completely unnecessary levels of privilege. It completely counteracts the principle of these privilege. And the way to understand that is to think about your Microsoft tenants like a block of apartments. When I buy an apartment or I'm going to rent an apartment, let's say you're offering me, $2,000 to rent every month. Prices have gone up, unfortunately. And then someone else comes along and they say, okay, well, I'm going to rent you the same apartment for $1,000 a month. But now there's no front door. And in this apartment block, every single apartment has no front door and you can all walk into each other's spaces. And you don't know who these people are and they change every week. Would you rent it even though it's half the price? No, no. Because on a human level, I want to feel safe. I want to know no one's going to come through my door and cause all this harm. The wild thing is in a Microsoft tenant, that principle doesn't really exist. So you can't create really clear segments. I can't say, I want to make sure that this administrator can only access these mailbox and can only manage these SharePoint sites. You can't do that. They have some segmentation, but it's very basic. What this means is if I'm an administrator and I get, for example, an Exchange administrator account, I can manage all the mailboxes in the tenant. For a small organization, that's probably fine. When you get to a large organization where you have multiple different regional teams living in that same environment, this is very dangerous because if my account gets compromised somehow, or if you hire a North Korean posing as a worker from your local region, let's say the United States, this happens all the time right now. People don't even realize they're hiring North Koreans because they're using really sophisticated AI. And then you end up giving this person a privileged account and you're paying them for the privilege to get it because you think you're hiring an IT worker. They get in and now instead of having access to 5 mailboxes or whatever they need, they've got access to thousands because by default, Microsoft's privilege settings are just wild. It's tenant wide. So the ability for a cyber criminal to move from a foothold right to the point of tenant takeover is it's way too much. These attacks shouldn't be happening. And I know we all need to take responsibility for our cybersecurity, but it's worth saying this is a problem with Microsoft's architecture, not with the security teams who are trying to deal with it. So what you need is a capability to segment the level of access. You can do this as an organization by splitting the one tenant into 10 different tenants, because that means each tenant's a bit more self-contained, although they are going to be connected. But the problem is this. Now you've got 10 environments where you have to monitor the configurations, right? So we go back to the first problem. What you need is a capability to segment access. So if someone gets in, the likelihood of the total tenant takeover scenario is massively reduced. And that's why I love your question. It's not how do we manage privileges, it's how do we reduce the standing privileges, because that's the key to preventing the impact of an attack when it happens.
So we're running up on time, but I have two more questions that I'd like to speak to you about. And you touched on it, and it's AI, right? AI is evolving at a rapid rate, but a lot of organizations are not ready for it. And when we look at it from a tenanted hardening perspective, how should organizations regain control without actually slowing down innovation?
So that's the golden question, isn't it? How do you reduce the level of access and improve security without impacting everyone? Um, there are ways you can do it, and the key thing is to make sure the platform is usable. So, as an example, I'm going to speak very specifically about Coreview here because it's the best example I can think of. That when we do our tenant segmentation capabilities, you might think like, oh, every administrator is going to lose access. It's going to slow them down. We actually build it all into a highly usable platform. So the platform improves your ability to deal with your day-to-day administration because everything's easy to manage. It's all in one place. Microsoft isn't constantly updating it. And then you just delegate exactly what that individual needs. So you're making things more usable. You're introducing automation. We also have an AI assistant that you can offload things to if you want to improve. But it's all happening within a contained environment where you have what you need. And it's easy for me as the person who's trying to do this to choose what you need.
Quite interesting. Thanks for that. And as we wrap up now, from your perspective, is there any key takeaways or tips that you would like to leave our audience with, especially when it comes to the Microsoft 360 environment? And what would you say are the top three actionable tips for decision makers this year?
I would definitely recommend number one, building that Excel sheet, going through the exercise, because as cumbersome as that might be, it might well be that the exercise failure is what enables you to actually invest in automation here. You can say to your team, look, we have to do this. We need to keep track of what our critical configurations are because of these possible scenarios. Let's build the spreadsheet. Let's go through it. You might find your tenant is not as unwieldy as some are. You might find that it is. And that's going to help you build the business case to invest in configuration level control and backup. The other thing I would highly recommend is remembering the glass analogy. The glass analogy is the best way to take, if you're concerned about this, to take this to your team and to explain, our Microsoft tenant is holding our entire business together. And if we lose it, if we lose the configurations, we're going to be in trouble. How do our business continuity plans make sure that we can recover the container, not just the stuff inside of it? That analogy is very useful to evangelize this idea. And the last thing I would say, and I touched on it earlier, is just to take heart that some of these gaps aren't anyone's fault. We are living in a time where tools are changing so fast. Microsoft 365 has just become the foundation of our entire organizations by stealth, I think, just piece by piece. And Microsoft, as always, their focus is on building a collaboration space. Their focus is on building a platform that can enable productivity, not a platform that's going to be deeply secure. So the gap exists. We see it. That's why we're here, Coreview, to fill in this new emerging gap. And there's going to be new ones, and this is just part of the game. So take heart. It's not your fault. A lot of it's Microsoft's fault, and we'll work on it together.
Perfect. Well, Rob, that was a some good advice. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and experience with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Trisha. Take care.
And that wraps up this episode of the Security Strategist podcast. Thank you to all that have joined us. We hope you took a lot away from this episode. So for further information on what we've talked about, please head over to www.coreview.com. You'll see it on your screen right now. And we'll be back next week with another episode of the podcast series. Until then, goodbye.